the production dashboard was red. Not warning yellow, not cautionary orange, pure, blazing crimson across every single metric tile. In 12 years of building data infrastructure at Nearday Technologies, I had never seen that particular shade of catastrophic failure paint itself across our monitoring systems. The error message blinking at the center read, fatal, 0 records ingested across all sources. Historical data integrity, compromised. This shouldn't be possible. Our pipeline had 17 redundancy layers, automated rollback protocols, and circuit breakers specifically designed to prevent complete data loss. Someone would have had to deliberately bypass every single safeguard we'd engineered into the system. My name is Denison. I'm 41 years old, and until 4 days ago, I was the senior data architect responsible for every byte that flowed through Nearday's analytics infrastructure. I sat in a cubicle near the emergency exit on the 3rd floor, close enough to the server room that I could hear the cooling fans when the building went quiet at night. I'd held this role for 8 years, built the entire data pipeline from scratch, and maintained a perfect uptime record of 99.97%. 4 days ago, everything changed. It started 3 months back, on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because it was the day after we'd successfully migrated our legacy Oracle databases to the new cloud-native stack, a project I'd spent 18 months planning down to the minute. The migration had gone flawlessly. Not a single transaction dropped, not a single report delayed. I'd sent the all-clear email to leadership at 6:47 a.m. and was reviewing post-migration metrics when my manager, Glenn Sutherland, appeared at my cubicle. Glenn was 52, perpetually tanned from weekend golf, and wore ties that cost more than my monthly car payment. He'd been promoted into the data division 6 months earlier from the sales side of the business, which meant he understood revenue pipelines far better than data ones. Annie, got a minute? He didn't wait for my answer, just gestured toward the conference room. Inside, seated at the head of the table, was someone I didn't recognize. She looked about 28, dressed in that particular Silicon Valley uniform of expensive sneakers, designer jeans, and a hoodie from a startup that had been acquired for 8 figures. Her laptop was covered in stickers from various tech conferences. She was typing furiously, didn't look up when we entered. Annie, this is Kendra Yamamoto, Glenn said, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness managers use when delivering bad news. She's joining us from the cloud architecture team. Really sharp with the new stack, Kubernetes, serverless functions, all that cutting-edge stuff. I nodded politely. Welcome aboard. Are you joining the data team? Glenn smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Actually, she's going to be taking over the data pipeline. She understands the new stack better than you do. The words landed like a physical blow, but I kept my face neutral. Years of corporate survival had taught me never to react in the moment. I see, I said quietly. What will my role be? We're restructuring. You'll transition to legacy system maintenance, keep the old stuff running while we modernize everything else. Kendra's going to rebuild the pipeline using modern best practices. Should save us a ton on infrastructure costs too. Kendra finally looked up from her laptop. Don't worry, I'm sure your old system was fine for its time. But we're moving toward a microservices architecture with event-driven patterns. Real-time processing, not these batch jobs you've got running. She said batch jobs the way someone might say horse and buggy. I looked at Glenn. The pipeline processes 47 million records daily across 183 data sources. It handles customer transactions, financial reconciliation, regulatory reporting, and feeds into every analytics product we sell. The architecture was designed for reliability and audit compliance, not just speed. Right, exactly, Kendra said, tapping her pen against the table. That's the old mindset. We don't need all that overhead anymore. Cloud-native tools handle that stuff automatically. Glenn stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Let's plan for a 2-week transition. Annie, document everything for Kendra. She'll shadow you, learn the systems, and then take it from there. I wanted to explain that 2 weeks wasn't nearly enough to understand the nuances of our data ecosystem. I wanted to walk through the 87 different business rules embedded in our transformation layer, the custom reconciliation logic that kept our financial reports accurate, the carefully tuned error handling that had taken years to perfect. But Glenn's expression made it clear this wasn't a discussion. I'll prepare the documentation, I said, and walked out. Let me explain what they were actually messing with here. Our data pipeline wasn't just some simple ETL process you could rebuild over a weekend. It was the central nervous system of Nearday Technologies. Think of it like this: imagine a massive river system with 183 tributaries, each flowing at different speeds, carrying different types of cargo, subject to different weather patterns. Some tributaries are mountain streams that rush down with fresh data every few minutes. Those are our real-time transaction systems. Others are deep, slow-moving channels that only update once a month. Those are our partner integrations and regulatory feeds. Every single tributary has to be monitored, filtered, cleaned, and merged into the main river without contamination, without loss, and in the exact sequence required by downstream consumers. Our pipeline had grown organically over 8 years, adapting to each new acquisition, each regulatory change, each business pivot. It had layers of validation that checked data quality at 17 different stages. It had circuit breakers that would shut down problematic sources before they could corrupt the warehouse. It had audit logs that tracked every single transformation, every single business rule application, every single data lineage path, because when regulators came asking questions, we needed to prove exactly where every number came from. I'd built all of this with surgical precision. Each component had been stress-tested, each failure mode had been anticipated and handled. The system was complex, yes, but that complexity was earned through necessity, not through poor design. The transition period began the next day. Kendra showed up at my desk with a notebook and an attitude that suggested she was doing me a favor by listening. "Okay, so walk me through the basics," she said, spinning in my spare chair. "What's the tech stack?" I pulled up the architecture diagram, a sprawling map of interconnected systems that took up my entire center monitor. We use a combination of Apache NiFi for orchestration, custom Python services for transformations, PostgreSQL for staging, and... Wait, NiFi? She laughed. That's ancient. Why aren't you using Airflow or Prefect? NiFi gives us visual flow management and built-in data provenance tracking. For regulatory compliance, we need to prove the lineage of every. Yeah, but Airflow is industry standard now. And it's way more flexible. She was already typing notes, not looking at my screen. What about your transformations? Please tell me you're not writing raw SQL. We use a combination of SQL for set-based operations and Python for complex business logic. Each transformation has unit tests, integration tests, and we maintain a separate test environment that mirrors production exactly. She made a face. That sounds incredibly slow to iterate on. We should be using dbt for transformations. It's declarative, version-controlled, and you can deploy changes in minutes instead of days. I took a breath. The reason we're careful about deployments is that we process financial data. A bug in a transformation can cause millions in misreported revenue. We've had cases where a single incorrect decimal placement would have. Right, fear-driven development. She wrote something in her notebook. Look, I get that you've had to be conservative because the tools weren't good enough. But modern platforms have solved these problems. We can move fast without breaking things because the tooling is better. Over the next 2 weeks, I tried to transfer not just the technical knowledge but the wisdom, the hard-earned understanding of why certain things were built certain ways. I showed her the reconciliation module that compared our pipeline outputs against source system reports every night. This catches about 15 errors per week on average. Usually they're caused by upstream schema changes or time zone handling issues. The module automatically quarantines bad batches and alerts us before they hit the warehouse. Kendra waved her hand dismissively. That's because you're doing batch processing. If we stream everything in real time and use schema validation at ingestion, we don't need this reconciliation overhead. I showed her the rate-limiting logic that prevented us from overwhelming partner APIs. We've negotiated specific SLAs with each vendor. Some of them have hard limits. If we exceed them, they'll block our IP for 24 hours, which means we lose critical data feeds. We can use exponential backoff and jitter, she said. That's like standard practice in distributed systems. Every session went like this. I would explain a carefully designed safeguard, and she would propose a modern alternative that completely missed the point of why the safeguard existed in the first place. She saw complexity and assumed incompetence. She couldn't imagine that the complexity was intentional, necessary, earned through painful experience. On the Friday of the second week, I prepared a comprehensive handoff document, 124 pages covering architecture decisions, failure modes, recovery procedures, contact lists for each data source, and a troubleshooting guide organized by symptom. I added a section called Critical Warnings that highlighted the most dangerous changes someone could make. Kendra flipped through it during our final meeting, spending maybe 90 seconds per page. This is great for reference, but honestly, I'm planning to rebuild most of this from scratch anyway. No offense, but legacy systems need legacy approaches. We're going to modernize the whole stack. Glenn was there too, looking pleased. That's the spirit. Annie's done good work here, but it's time to bring things into the 21st century. Annie, you'll be available for questions though, right? Of course, I said. My extension and email won't change. As I cleaned out my desk near the pipeline monitoring station, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Anger, certainly. Resentment at being replaced by someone who'd spent 2 weeks dismissing everything I'd built. But also something else, a dark curiosity about what would happen next. I wasn't planning revenge. I'm not that kind of person. But I also wasn't going to lose sleep protecting a system I no longer controlled. My new role was in a basement office that smelled like old carpet and electrical ozone. Legacy system maintenance meant keeping alive the ancient applications that still ran critical business functions but that nobody wanted to talk about at leadership meetings. It was boring work, beneath my skill level, but it had one significant advantage: nobody bothered me. I spent my first few days setting up my new workspace, organizing documentation for systems that predated my time at the company. Occasionally I'd get an email from Kendra asking basic questions: where's the connection string for the customer database, or what's the password for the production NiFi instance? I answered each query politely, providing exactly what was asked and nothing more. I didn't volunteer context. I didn't offer warnings. When she asked for the database credentials, I sent them. I didn't mention that those credentials had read-only access and that she'd need to request elevated privileges through the security team for any structural changes. 2 weeks into my exile, I had lunch with Charlie Hendricks, one of the data analysts who'd been at Nearday almost as long as I had. We met at the Vietnamese place across the street, sitting in our usual booth near the window. "How's the new gig?" Charlie asked, though his sympathetic expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Quiet," I said. "How's Kendra doing?" Charlie grimaced. "Honestly? It's chaos. She ripped out half the pipeline on her second day. Said she was eliminating technical debt. Replaced the NiFi flows with some custom Python scripts running in Docker containers. Did she migrate the business logic correctly? No idea. She keeps telling everyone not to worry about it, that her new architecture is self-healing and inherently more robust." He made air quotes with his fingers. "But I've started seeing weird gaps in the data. Small stuff mostly, missing records here and there, timestamps that don't line up. When I ask her about it, she says it's temporary turbulence from the migration." I ate my pho slowly, saying nothing. "The thing is," Charlie continued, "management loves her. She sends these slick weekly updates full of metrics about infrastructure cost savings and pipeline efficiency improvements. Glenn forwarded one to the whole department yesterday. Apparently she's reduced our cloud computing costs by 40%. That got my attention. How? She consolidated a bunch of our processing. Instead of running separate jobs for each data source like you had, she's batching everything together into one big daily job. Uses way less compute time. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. She's running everything in a single job? All 183 sources? Yeah, I think so. Why? I chose my words carefully. Our sources have different SLAs and different criticality levels. Some need to be processed every hour for real-time dashboards. Some are okay to batch daily. Some have dependencies, they need other sources to complete first before their transformations will work correctly. Running them all together means the system becomes brittle. One failure brings down everything instead of being isolated. Charlie set down his spoon. Should I be worried? I'm not in a position to say, I replied. I don't manage the pipeline anymore. Over the next few weeks, I heard rumors. The reconciliation module had been disabled because it was causing unnecessary alerts. The rate limiting had been loosened because we were leaving performance on the table. The audit logging had been streamlined to reduce storage costs. Each change made perfect sense in isolation, if you didn't understand the broader context. Each change shaved costs and reduced complexity. Each change also removed a safety net. Then, 6 weeks after my demotion, Kendra sent a request that made me sit up straight in my basement office. The email subject was urgent, production override needed. Annie, I need the master override credentials for the pipeline. We're doing some architectural changes that require elevated access, and the security team is being really slow about approving my request. Glenn said you have emergency credentials that can bypass the approval process. Can you send those over? Need them today to stay on schedule. K. I stared at the email for a long time. The master override credentials she was referring to were break glass emergency access that I'd set up for disaster recovery situations. They bypassed every security control, every approval workflow, every audit checkpoint. I'd used them exactly twice in 8 years, once during a ransomware attack, and once when our primary database cluster failed catastrophically and we needed to restore from backups immediately. The credentials were in a sealed envelope in the CTO safe. There was a procedure for accessing them that involved written justification, approval from 2 executives, and automatic notification to the security team. They were not something you use to stay on schedule on an architecture change. I replied, those credentials are for emergency use only and require executive approval to access. What specific architectural change needs them? There might be a safer alternative approach. Her response came back in minutes, we're migrating the financial reconciliation data to a new schema. The regular approval process would take 3 weeks and we need to launch the new dashboard next week. Glenn's already aware and supportive. Just need the creds to execute. My jaw clenched. Financial reconciliation data was the most sensitive information we had. It was what we reported to regulators, what our auditors examined, what our revenue recognition was based on. Migrating it to a new schema without proper testing and validation could introduce calculation errors that wouldn't be discovered for months. I called Glenn. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. Annie? What's up? I'm about to hop on a call. Kendra's asking for the emergency override credentials. She says you approved it for a schema migration. Yeah, she needs to move some data around. Seemed straightforward. You can give her the access, right? Glenn, those credentials bypass every safety control in the system. They're designed for emergency recovery, not for routine changes. And migrating financial data without going through proper testing could. Annie. His voice turned cold. I appreciate your concern, but you're not managing the pipeline anymore. Kendra is. If she says she needs elevated access to do her job efficiently, then that's what she needs. Are you going to provide the credentials or do I need to get them another way? I felt the anger rising but kept my voice level. The credentials are in the CTO safe. The access procedure is documented in the disaster recovery plan. Section 4. Fine. I'll handle it. He hung up. I sat there, heart pounding. Part of me wanted to escalate this further, to send an email to the CTO explaining why this was dangerous. But another part of me, the part that had been humiliated, demoted, and dismissed for 8 weeks, was tired of protecting people from their own decisions. I pulled up the disaster recovery documentation and saw that Glenn had checked out the credentials that afternoon. According to the automated alert, Kendra had used them 17 minutes later. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong with an unvalidated schema migration on financial data. Decimal precision errors. Time zone conversion mistakes. Mismatched joins that would silently drop records. Currency calculation bugs that would compound over time. The next morning, I checked my monitoring dashboard. Yes, I still had read-only access to the pipeline metrics, a vestige of my old role that nobody had thought to revoke. Everything looked normal. Data volumes were within expected ranges. Job completion times were green. 3 more days passed. The metrics stayed green. I started to relax. Then came Tuesday morning. I was reviewing some documentation for a legacy HR system when my phone buzzed. A text from Charlie, check the pipeline dashboard. I pulled it up. Yellow warnings were cascading across multiple sources. Not red failures yet, but concerning. I drilled into the details and saw data validation errors, lots of them. Records that didn't match expected formats. Calculations that were off by small amounts. I picked up my phone to call Charlie when it rang. Glenn's name on the screen. Annie, get up here now. Conference room 3. He didn't wait for my response, just hung up. I took the stairs 2 at a time. When I burst through the conference room door, the scene was even worse than I'd imagined. Glenn stood at the head of the table, red-faced and sweating. Kendra sat slumped in a chair, laptop open, frantically typing. On the wall monitor, the production dashboard blazed red across every single metric. Why is all the data missing? Glenn shouted the moment he saw me. 4 days before the quarterly earnings call, and you've somehow lost every piece of financial data we have. I looked at the dashboard more carefully. It wasn't that data was missing, it was that the data pipeline had detected massive integrity failures and automatically quarantined everything to prevent corrupted data from reaching the warehouse. Exactly as designed. I haven't touched the pipeline in 6 weeks, I said calmly. What changed? Kendra looked up, eyes wild. Nothing changed. I just did a simple schema migration like we discussed. Everything was working fine until this morning when the monthly close process ran and suddenly everything's breaking. Monthly close. That was the process that ran on the first Tuesday of every month, pulling data from all sources to generate the official financial reports. It was the most comprehensive validation we did, checking data integrity across the entire history of records. What exactly did you change in the schema migration? I asked. I just consolidated some tables and updated the reconciliation logic to be more efficient. She pulled up her laptop screen. Look, I reduced the number of joins from 17 to 3, eliminated redundant validation steps, and optimized the calculation sequences. It should be faster and cleaner. I felt my stomach drop. You modified the financial reconciliation logic? The regulatory calculations? I didn't modify them, I optimized them. They were doing the same validations multiple times. I removed the duplication. Those weren't duplications, I said quietly. Those were sequential validation gates. Each one checked a different aspect of data quality and each one depended on the previous checks passing. The order mattered. Because of legacy complexity that isn't needed anymore. Kendra's voice was rising toward panic. I tested this. I ran it against sample data and everything worked. What sample data? Last month's data. I reprocessed October and got the same results. I closed my eyes. October was a normal month. November is a month-end close. The month-end process includes reconciliation across fiscal quarters, year-to-date calculations, and cross-validation against external partner reports. Did you test it against month-end data? Her silence was answer enough. Glenn slammed his hand on the table. I don't care about testing details. I care that we have an earnings call on Friday and no data to report. Fix it. I looked at the dashboard again. The automated quarantine had done its job, it had prevented bad data from contaminating the warehouse. But it had also stopped all data processing. Every downstream system was starving. Analytics dashboards were blank. Reports were failing. Customer-facing metrics had flatlined. The system is protecting itself, I said. It detected data integrity failures and shut down to prevent corruption. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. So override it. Glenn shouted. Use your emergency credentials and push the data through. If I override the integrity checks, we'll load corrupted financial data into the warehouse. That data will feed into our earnings report. We could end up reporting incorrect revenue to the SEC. Kendra was typing frantically. I can roll back my changes. I kept backups of the old schema. If I just restore everything. Don't. I said it sharply enough that she stopped typing. Rolling back the schema now won't restore the data that's already been processed incorrectly. And if you restore the schema while quarantine data is still in the staging layer, you'll create orphaned records that will corrupt the rollback. Glenn's face was purple now. Then what do we do? I pulled out a chair and sat down, opening my own laptop. We need to understand exactly what broke and why. Then we need to manually validate and correct the data before we can safely resume processing. It's going to take time. How much time? I thought about the scope of what Kendra had changed. The optimized reconciliation logic she'd deployed. The validation gates she'd removed. The calculation sequences she'd reordered. If we work around the clock? Maybe 3 days to identify all the errors, correct them, and validate that the corrections are accurate enough for regulatory reporting. 3 days. The earnings call is in 4. Then we'll be cutting it very close. I looked at Kendra. I'm going to need detailed documentation of every change you made to the reconciliation logic. Commit logs, test results, everything. She nodded, looking pale. Over the next 72 hours, I barely left the office. Charlie joined me, along with 2 other senior analysts who understood the financial reporting requirements. We set up a war room, covering the walls with printouts of data validation failures. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. Kendra's optimization had introduced subtle calculation errors across 14 different financial metrics. Most were small, a few cents here and there on individual transactions. But when you aggregated millions of transactions, those few cents became hundreds of thousands of dollars in misreported revenue. She'd also broken the currency conversion logic by reordering the calculation sequence. The old logic had converted currencies before applying discount calculations, while her optimized version did it after. For most transactions, it made no difference. But for international deals with volume-based discounts, it created a compounding error that grew larger with each transaction. Worst of all, she'd eliminated a validation step that checked for duplicate transaction IDs. Without it, the monthly close process had double-counted about 40,000 transactions. In aggregate, this would have inflated our reported revenue by $3.2 million. If we had pushed that data through to earnings, the SEC investigation that followed would have destroyed the company. On Thursday afternoon, 36 hours before the earnings call, I finished the last validation run. The corrected data was clean. The reconciliation matched external reports. The audit trails were complete. I called Glenn. We're ready to resume processing. He exhaled shakily. Thank God. Load it up. There's going to be a conversation about what happened here, I said. Later. Right now, just get the data flowing. I enabled the pipeline. Within minutes, the dashboard shifted from red to yellow to green. Data began flowing into the warehouse. Reports started generating. By evening, the earnings team had the numbers they needed. I went home, slept for 12 hours, and came back Friday morning to find an urgent meeting request from the CTO, Lawrence Blackthorne. Lawrence was 60, meticulous, and had built his career on risk management. He'd been out of the country during the crisis, returning Thursday night to find a 5-alarm fire that had somehow been contained. The meeting included Glenn, Kendra, myself, and Stephanie Kowalski from internal audit. Lawrence started without preamble. I've reviewed the incident timeline and the analysis Annie prepared. I have questions. He looked at Glenn. When did you authorize the use of emergency override credentials for a schema migration? Glenn shifted uncomfortably. Kendra needed elevated access to implement some architecture improvements. The normal approval process was too slow. The normal approval process exists because schema changes to financial data require validation by our audit team, Stephanie said quietly. That's not bureaucracy, it's regulatory compliance. The override credentials were never meant to bypass that. Kendra assured me she'd tested the changes thoroughly, Glenn said defensively. Lawrence turned to Kendra. Walk me through your testing process. She explained her testing against October data. Lawrence listened without expression. So you tested a month-end close process without using month-end data, he said when she finished. Did you consult with the audit team about what validations were required? I didn't think I needed to. The changes were mostly about efficiency, not functionality. The changes altered regulatory calculation sequences, Stephanie interjected, sliding a document across the table. This is the list of errors we found. 14 different calculation discrepancies, currency conversion failures, and duplicate transaction processing. If this data had been reported, we would have overstated revenue by $3.2 million in a public filing. The room went very quiet. Lawrence looked at me. The automated quarantine system, that was part of your original design? Yes. It's designed to detect data integrity failures and shut down processing before corrupted data can reach the warehouse. The threshold is calibrated based on historical error rates. When errors exceed 5 sigma from normal, it assumes something is fundamentally broken and stops everything. And if that system hadn't been in place? I thought about the earnings call that would have happened. The press release announcing inflated revenue. The eventual correction. The SEC investigation. The class action lawsuits. We would have reported fraudulent numbers to the SEC unintentionally, but fraudulent nonetheless. Lawrence nodded slowly. He looked at Glenn. You told me this restructuring would reduce costs and improve efficiency. What you didn't mention was that it would remove safety controls that protect us from regulatory violations. That wasn't the intent. I don't care about intent. I care about outcomes. Lawrence's voice was sharp now. We nearly committed securities fraud because someone made unauthorized changes to financial systems without proper validation. That's unacceptable. He turned to Kendra. I'm sure you're talented. But you're not ready for this level of responsibility. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Kendra's face went white. She started to speak, then stopped. After a moment, she closed her laptop and left. Lawrence looked at Glenn. You authorized the use of emergency credentials for a non-emergency. You approved schema changes without requiring proper validation. You created an environment where regulatory controls could be bypassed for the sake of efficiency. I'm recommending to the board that you be removed from any role with oversight of financial systems. Glenn's jaw worked soundlessly. Then he stood and walked out without a word. Finally, Lawrence turned to me. Annie, I've read your original handoff documentation. All 124 pages. And I've read the incident analysis you prepared over the last 3 days. You understand these systems better than anyone. I waited. I'm creating a new role, Director of Data Infrastructure and Compliance. It will report directly to me. The role will have authority over all data systems that feed financial reporting, with veto power over any architectural changes that could impact regulatory compliance. Interested? I thought about my basement office. About being dismissed as a legacy thinker. About watching someone dismantle in weeks what had taken years to build. What about the cost savings Glenn was chasing? False economy. The pipeline costs what it costs because it does what it needs to do. I'd rather pay for proper infrastructure than pay SEC fines. He slid a folder across the table. Here's the offer letter. 30% salary increase. Budget authority to hire 2 additional senior architects. And a mandate to rebuild the team properly. I opened the folder, scanned the numbers. More than fair. I accept. Good. First priority, document every control and validation in the system. Second priority, implement additional safeguards so this can never happen again. Third priority, train the next generation properly, which means taking time to explain why things work the way they do, not just how they work. Over the following weeks, I moved back to my old desk, hired 2 excellent engineers who actually listened when I explained the reasons behind architectural decisions, and began the work of reinforcing the systems that had saved us. Glenn was quietly reassigned to a business development role with no direct reports. Kendra, I learned from LinkedIn, landed at a startup doing cryptocurrency analytics. I hoped they had better safeguards than she'd left us with. The quarterly earnings call went forward as scheduled. The numbers were accurate. The SEC didn't come knocking. And somewhere in our infrastructure, buried in monitoring logs that most people never read, was a record of the moment when the system I'd built had done exactly what it was designed to do, protect the company from its own mistakes. I think about that sometimes, when I'm reviewing a proposed architecture change or explaining to a new engineer why we can't just move fast and break things with financial data. The complexity isn't accidental. The safeguards aren't paranoia. The careful processes aren't bureaucracy. They're the accumulated wisdom of every near miss, every late-night debugging session, every regulatory requirement learned the hard way. They're the invisible architecture that keeps the lights on and the regulators at bay. And sometimes, when someone tries to tear that down in the name of modernization, the system fights back.